If you are enjoying this video, smash that like button, subscribe, and hit the bell. Share it with your friends, and let me know in the comments where you are watching from. Every like and subscribe helps the channel grow. My name is James Mackenzie, and I've been a ranger at the Boundary Waters Outpost for nearly 15 years now. Most folks around here just call me Mac. At 45, I've seen my fair share of Minnesota winters, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened in December 1963. I live alone in my ranger cabin with my German Shepherd Rex. Well, not completely alone. I've got my old Winchester rifle and my grandfather's silver compass to keep me company. Sometimes, late at night, I catch myself talking to Sarah's photo on the mantle. My wife, she passed away from cancer 2 years ago. The doctor said it was quick, but watching someone you love fade away is never quick enough. The cabin sits at the edge of one of the oldest pine forests in Minnesota, right near the Canadian border. Most days, I'm perfectly fine with the solitude. After 20 years in the Marines as a sniper, you get used to being alone with your thoughts. But this winter was different. It started with the cold. Not your regular Minnesota cold. We're used to that up here. This was something else. The thermometer outside my cabin dropped to -45 degrees Fahrenheit, and it kept dropping. The pine trees were cracking from the frost, sounding like gunshots in the night. Even Rex, who usually loves the snow, started acting strange, growling at shadows between the trees. Then the reports started coming in. 3 hikers gone missing in 2 weeks. Now, people getting lost in the Boundary Waters isn't uncommon, but something about these disappearances felt wrong. The last radio transmission from one of them still haunts me. The tracks, they keep changing size. And the crying? Does anyone else hear the crying? I remember that morning clearly. I was sitting at my radio desk, nursing my 3rd cup of coffee, when Tom Blackwood, our local guide, burst through my door. His face was white as the snow outside, and his hands were shaking as he told me about the tracks he'd found. Tracks that seemed to appear and disappear at random, leading to nowhere on the frozen lakes. That same afternoon, Chief White Eagle from the local Ojibwe tribe paid me a visit. I'll never forget the look in his ancient eyes as he sat across from me, his weathered hands wrapped around a mug of hot coffee. "The hunger spirit is awakening," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Our ancestors spoke of this. When the winter is at its darkest and grief hangs heavy in the air, it returns to feed. I didn't want to believe him then. 20 years in the Marines and 15 years as a ranger had taught me to trust what I could see, what I could touch. But as I sit here now, writing this down, my hands still shaking, my remaining fingers aching from the frostbite, I wish I had listened sooner. This is the story of what happened during those 7 days in December 1963, a story about an ancient evil that dwells in the coldest corners of these woods. A story about loss, survival, and the price we pay for facing our deepest fears. And it all began with those tracks in the snow leading into darkness. The morning after Tom's visit, I decided to check out those strange tracks myself. The sun was barely up, and the cold hit my face like a slap. Rex trotted beside me, his breath making little clouds in the freezing air. The snow was deep, about 6 feet in some places, but I've learned to move quietly even in these conditions. Old habits from my Marine days, I guess? I found the first campsite around noon. Something wasn't right about it. The tent was still standing, sleeping bags inside, and there was a pot of beans on a small camping stove. When I touched the pot, it was still warm. My heart started beating faster. Warm food meant someone was here very recently, but there were no people in sight. No footprints leading away either, which made no sense at all. Rex usually loves sniffing around campsites, hoping for leftover food, but this time, he just stood there, his ears flat against his head, making a low whining sound I'd never heard before. That's when I noticed the tracks Tom had talked about. At first, they looked like normal human footprints, about my size. But as I followed them, something strange happened. Every few steps, they got bigger, much bigger. The last prints were huge, deeper too, like whatever made them was getting heavier. Then, just like that, they disappeared completely, right in the middle of untouched snow. I pulled out my radio to call it in, but all I got was static and something else. A sound that made my blood run cold. It was like children crying, but not quite right. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. Rex started barking at the trees, his fur standing up. The temperature dropped suddenly. I know because my breath turned from vapor to tiny ice crystals right in front of my eyes. The trees around us. I swear they bent away from something, like they were trying to get away. I've been in these woods for 15 years, but I'd never seen anything like it. That's when my grandfather's compass started acting weird. The needle spun in circles, faster and faster. The same compass that had never failed me once in all these years was going crazy. I felt a chill run down my spine, and it wasn't from the cold. I'm not a man who scares easily. I've seen combat, faced death before, but something about this felt different, wrong. The kind of wrong that makes your instincts scream at you to run, even when your mind can't explain why. As the sun started to set, I made my way back to the outpost. The whole way home, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. Rex stayed close to my legs, which he never does. Even he knew something wasn't right in our woods anymore. That night, I couldn't sleep. The radio kept making those crying sounds, and the temperature outside dropped to -50. As I sat in my cabin, checking and rechecking my rifle, I remembered Chief White Eagle's words about the hunger spirit. For the first time in my life, I started to wonder if some of those old stories might be true after all. I didn't know it then, but this was just the beginning. The real horror was still to come, and it would test everything I thought I knew about reality, about survival, and about myself. The next morning, I got a call from Dr. Sarah Reynolds, our local wildlife biologist. Her voice was shaking. "Mac, you need to see this," she said. "I found something that shouldn't be possible." I drove my truck to her research cabin, with Rex in the back seat. The whole way there, the radio kept cutting in and out, playing those weird crying sounds. I tried to tell myself it was just interference from the cold, but deep down, I knew better. Sarah was waiting outside her cabin, holding a camera. She looked like she hadn't slept all night. "Look at these," she said, showing me some photos of dead animals she'd found. Deer, wolves, even a bear, all frozen solid, but something was wrong. Their insides were missing, but there were no cuts, no blood, no signs of how anything got inside them. While we were looking at the photos, Tom Blackwood showed up. He looked different, pale and jumpy, like he was scared of his own shadow. "I followed those tracks again," he said, his voice hoarse. "They led me to the old frozen lake. Mac, I saw something there, something big." That's when Rex started acting strange again. He stood up, fur bristling, and stared into the woods. The temperature dropped so fast our coffee froze in our cups. The trees around us went quiet. No birds, no wind, nothing. Just silence. Sarah's camera stopped working. Then our phones. Then my radio. It was like everything electronic just died. "We need to go see Chief White Eagle," I said. "Now." We piled into my truck, but Tom said he'd catch up later. As we drove away, I saw him in my mirror, standing there, staring at the woods. Something about the way he looked made me uneasy. The chief lived in a small house near the Ojibwe sacred grounds. When we got there, he was already outside, like he'd been expecting us. His face was grim. "It's happening faster than I feared," he said, leading us inside. "The Wendigo has awakened." He told us about the ancient spirit, a creature born from hunger and cold, that could make people see things that weren't there, make them so hungry they'd do terrible things. "It feeds on more than flesh," the chief said. "It feeds on grief, on guilt, on loneliness." I thought about Sarah's photo on my mantle, about the emptiness I'd felt since losing her. Was that what drew this thing here? As the chief talked, the day grew darker, even though it was only noon. Outside, snow started falling, but it fell. Wrong. Upward instead of down. Rex wouldn't stop whining. Then we heard it, a scream from the direction of Sarah's cabin. It sounded like Tom, but not quite. Like something trying to sound like Tom. Sarah grabbed my arm. "Mac," she whispered, pointing at the window. There, in the swirling snow, we saw a figure. Tall, impossibly tall, white as bone. And it was looking right at us. The chief started chanting something in Ojibwe, but I barely heard him, because in that moment, I realized something terrible. This thing hadn't just found us. It had been hunting us all along. We ran back inside the chief's house, and I grabbed my rifle. Not that I thought bullets would help much against whatever that thing was, but holding it made me feel a little better. The chief quickly started burning some herbs, filling the house with sweet smoke. "Listen carefully," he said, his voice urgent but calm. "The Wendigo is strongest when it's snowing, and it can trick your mind. Whatever you see, whatever you hear, don't trust it." Just then, we heard Sarah's voice outside. "Mac, help me! Please, I'm hurt!" It sounded exactly like her, but Sarah was standing right next to me, her face white with fear. Rex started growling at the door. The temperature inside the house dropped so low I could see our breath. The chief handed each of us a small leather pouch filled with herbs. "Keep these close," he said. "They'll help you see through its tricks." Suddenly, the radio in my truck started playing. Not static this time, but my wife Sarah's voice. "James, why did you let me die alone?" My heart nearly stopped. The thing outside was using my deepest pain against me. That's when we heard real screaming coming from the direction of Sarah's research cabin. "Tom," Sarah whispered, "we have to help him." The chief grabbed my arm. "Your friend is already gone," he said sadly. "What you hear isn't him anymore." But I couldn't just sit there. I've never been good at doing nothing. "Stay here," I told Sarah. "Chief, keep her safe." I grabbed my rifle, checked my compass, still spinning wildly, and headed out into the storm with Rex. The snow was falling sideways now, and the wind felt like ice knives on my face. Rex stayed close, his fur covered in frost. We followed the screams to Sarah's cabin, but what we found there, I wish I could forget it. Tom was there, but he wasn't Tom anymore. He was standing in the snow, his skin pale as death, eating something. When he turned to look at me, his eyes were white and his mouth was full of blood. "So hungry, Mac," he said in a voice that wasn't his. "So very hungry." Rex started barking like crazy, and that's when I saw it, the real thing, standing behind Tom, 12 feet tall at least, skin stretched tight over bones, with antlers covered in ice and blood. The Wendigo. It looked right at me, and I felt a hunger so strong it almost brought me to my knees. Tom lunged at me, faster than any human should move. Rex jumped between us, protecting me like he always did. What happened next happened so fast. There was a fight, snarling, screaming. Then Rex yelped, and everything went quiet. I found myself running back through the woods, my dog's blood freezing on my hands, the sound of Tom's inhuman laughter following me. But I wasn't running back to the chief's house. Something was pulling me toward the old caves near the frozen lake, the same caves where we'd found those ancient paintings last summer. I knew then that this was all connected, the caves, the paintings, the stories, and somehow I had to end it before anyone else died. The sun was setting and the temperature was still dropping. As I ran, I could hear it behind me, not just following, but herding me toward the caves. Like it wanted me to go there. Looking back now, I realized that was exactly what it wanted, and I was playing right into its hands. The caves were dark and colder than anything I'd ever felt. My flashlight barely worked, giving off just enough light to see a few feet ahead. Every breath I took turned into ice crystals in the air. The silence was complete, the kind that makes your ears ring. I found the cave paintings quickly, red marks on the black rock walls. But now they seemed different, almost alive in my flashlight beam. They showed the same story over and over. Tall, skinny figures with antlers, surrounded by smaller figures that looked like people. In some drawings, the people were running. In others, they were lying down, maybe dead. That's when I heard Sarah's scream echoing through the caves. My heart jumped. The real Sarah, not the fake voice from before. I ran deeper into the caves, following her voice. The tunnel twisted and turned, getting narrower. Ice covered the walls, making them shine like mirrors. "Mac, help me." Sarah's voice was closer now. I turned a corner and froze. There she was, but something was wrong. She was standing completely still, like a statue. As I got closer, I realized with horror that she was frozen solid, her face frozen in a look of pure fear. "Beautiful, isn't it?" said a voice behind me. It was Tom, or what used to be Tom. His skin was blue-white now, and his eyes were completely empty. "The hunger makes everything so clear, Mac. You should join us." I raised my rifle, but Tom just laughed. The sound bounced off the ice walls, coming from everywhere at once. "You can't shoot all of us, Mac," he said. More voices joined his laugh, voices I recognized. The missing hikers. Then I saw it again, the Wendigo standing behind Tom. But this time, in the cave's icy walls, I could see it clearly. Its body was like a skeleton wrapped in gray skin, steam rising from its mouth. Those antlers weren't just covered in ice, they were made of ice. The thing spoke, using my wife's voice. "James, I've been so lonely without you." Something in me snapped. Maybe it was hearing it use Sarah's voice again, or maybe it was thinking about Rex dying to save me. I felt a rage so hot it seemed to push back the cave's cold. I remembered what Chief White Eagle had said about the creature feeding on grief and guilt. That's when I understood. I had to use my pain differently. Not to feed it, but to fight it. I pulled out the leather pouch of herbs the chief had given me and threw it at the Wendigo's feet. The herbs burst into blue flames, and the creature screamed, a sound like breaking ice and howling wind. The cave started shaking. Pieces of ice fell from the ceiling. Tom lunged at me, his fingers now long claws. I fired my rifle, the sound deafening in the cave. Tom fell, and I saw something dark leave his body, like smoke. But I wasn't done yet. The real fight was just beginning, and I had one more card to play. Something I'd learned from those cave paintings. Something that might end this, if it didn't kill me first. The cave was falling apart around us, but I knew what I had to do. In those cave paintings, there was always one thing that showed up: fire. Not regular fire, but something special. The Ojibwe people had used sacred flames to fight this thing before. I pulled out my lighter and the rest of the herbs the chief had given me. My hands were shaking from the cold, but I managed to light them. The smell filled the cave, sweet and strong, like pine needles and old memories. The Wendigo screamed again, but this time it was different. It sounded afraid. The creature backed away from the smoke, its long fingers scraping against the ice walls. But I followed it, holding the burning herbs in front of me like a shield. "You used my grief," I said, my voice shaking with anger. "You used Sarah's voice. You killed my dog. No more." The thing tried to trick me one last time. Suddenly, Sarah was standing there, not frozen like before, but just like I remembered her, smiling and beautiful. "James, please," it said with her voice. "Don't do this. Stay with me." My heart felt like it was being torn apart, but I kept moving forward. "Sarah's gone," I said, "and you're not her." The Wendigo's shape changed back, and it lunged at me with those terrible claws. I dove to the side, but not fast enough. Pain shot through my left hand as its claws caught me. 3 of my fingers went numb instantly, frozen solid. But I had it where I wanted it now, backed into the deepest part of the cave. I threw the burning herbs right at it. They hit its chest and stuck there, burning bright blue. The creature let out a scream that shook the whole cave. Ice started forming all around it, growing faster and faster. The Wendigo tried to break free, but the ice kept spreading. Soon it was completely covered, frozen solid in a block of ice that glowed faintly blue. The cave was collapsing now. I ran as fast as I could, holding my injured hand against my chest. Behind me, I heard the ice crack and shatter, and a final, distant scream that faded into nothing. I barely made it out before the cave entrance collapsed. Outside, the unnatural storm was ending. The snow fell normally again, and the temperature, while still cold, felt like regular Minnesota winter cold. Chief White Eagle found me there, kneeling in the snow. He didn't seem surprised. "It will sleep now," he said quietly, "for a long time, but not forever." We never found Sarah's body, or Tom's, or the missing hikers. The cave entrance was blocked by tons of rock and ice. My 3 fingers couldn't be saved, frostbite, the doctor said, but I know better. I still work as a ranger, but now I also help the Ojibwe people protect their sacred places. Sometimes on the coldest nights, I think I hear crying in the wind, or see strange tracks in the snow. When that happens, I hold my grandfather's compass tight and remember what I learned in those caves. Some things are better left alone. Some hungers can never be filled. And in the deepest parts of these woods, during the darkest part of winter, it's best to stay close to the fire and keep your grief close to your heart where it belongs. My name is Frank Hawthorne, and I never thought I'd be telling this story. Even now, my hands shake as I write about what happened in Devil's Den during that scorching summer of 1977. I was 38 then, fresh from a messy divorce and trying to outrun my demons from Vietnam by transferring from Yellowstone to this quiet corner of Arkansas. The day I drove into Ozark National Forest, the drought had turned everything brown and brittle. The trees looked like skeleton hands reaching up to the cloudless sky, and the usually bubbling streams were nothing but cracked mud. My old pickup truck kicked up dust as I followed the winding road to Devil's Den State Park, my new home. I remember checking my Colt Python, a habit I couldn't shake since NAM. The gun was like an old friend, modified just the way I liked it. Next to it sat my UV flashlight, a weird choice for a park ranger maybe. But cave exploration was my thing, and you never know what you might find in the dark. The park office was a small wooden building that had seen better days. Inside, the air conditioning was fighting a losing battle against the heat. Sally, the park secretary, looked up from her ancient typewriter and gave me a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "You must be Ranger Hawthorne," she said, shuffling some papers. "We weren't expecting you until tomorrow." "Thought I'd get an early start," I replied, wiping sweat from my forehead. That's when I noticed the missing persons posters on the bulletin board behind her. 3 of them, all dated within the last month. Later that night, in my new ranger cabin, I heard it for the first time, a sound that wasn't quite a howl and wasn't quite a scream, echoing from somewhere deep in the limestone caves. My radio crackled with static, and for a split second, I swear I heard words in that static. Words that made no sense. I told myself it was just nerves, just my mind playing tricks. After what I'd seen in NAM, I was used to my brain throwing curveballs. But as I stood there, watching the sun set behind the ancient trees, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me back. I didn't know it then, but that was just the beginning. The next few weeks would test everything I thought I knew about reality, about fear, and about survival. The caves of Devil's Den held secrets older than time, and they were about to be unleashed. The next morning started normally enough. I was checking reports at my desk when Tom, a local cattle farmer, burst through my door. His face was white as paper, and his hands wouldn't stop shaking. "Ranger Hawthorne, you gotta come see this," he stammered. Something got to my cows. 20 minutes later, I was standing in Tom's field, staring at something I couldn't explain. 3 of his cows lay dead, but it wasn't like any animal attack I'd ever seen. The cuts were clean, almost surgical. No blood anywhere, no tracks, nothing. "Never seen a bear or mountain lion do anything like this," Tom said, his voice barely a whisper. "And look at this." He pointed to the ground near the cows. there was a strange, glowing green substance, like someone had spilled glow stick liquid. I took out a sample jar and collected some. When I touched it, my fingers tingled and my flashlight flickered. On my way back to the station, my radio started acting weird again. Through the static, I heard what sounded like whispers. I turned it up, trying to make out the words, but they weren't in any language I knew. That afternoon, Deputy Marcus Riley showed up at my office. He was young, eager, and had that look of someone who hadn't seen real trouble yet. "Heard about the cows," he said, "but that's not why I'm here. We've been getting calls about strange lights in Cave Section B. Hikers say their phones die when they get close, and their compasses go crazy." I grabbed my gear, my modified Colt Python, UV flashlight, and cave equipment. Something in my gut told me these things were connected, but I didn't know how. As we drove to the cave entrance, Riley told me about the local legends, about how the Cherokee people used to warn their children never to go deep into certain caves, about how some caves were sealed with special rituals. The sun was setting when we reached Cave Section B. The entrance looked normal enough, but something felt off. The birds were silent, no insects buzzing, just dead quiet. Inside my head, a voice from my Vietnam days whispered, "Something's wrong here, Doc. Really wrong." I switched on my UV flashlight, and that's when we saw them. Markings on the cave walls that definitely weren't there during yesterday's routine check. They seemed to pulse faintly in the UV light, like a heartbeat. Riley took one look and crossed himself. "Those weren't here this morning," he said. "I did the morning patrol myself." I reached out to touch one of the markings, and my flashlight died. In the darkness, we heard something move deeper in the cave, something big. And then we heard the howl, the same one from last night, but closer, much closer. Riley's flashlight beam shook as he pointed it down the cave tunnel. "What do we do now, Ranger?" I checked my gun and took a deep breath. "We find out what's going on in these caves. But first, we need help. Real help." Little did I know, asking for help would bring together a team that would face something beyond our worst nightmares. The next morning, I made some calls. By afternoon, 2 people arrived who I hoped could help us make sense of all this. First was Billy Whitefeather, a local Cherokee elder. He was in his 60s, with long gray hair and eyes that seemed to look right through you. The second was Dr. Eleanor Wright, a geologist who specialized in cave systems. She came with a van full of scientific equipment. We sat in my office, the fan spinning lazily overhead, as I showed them the glowing substance I'd collected and photos of the cave markings. Billy touched the sample jar and pulled his hand back like it burned him. "These marks," he said quietly, "they're warnings. My grandfather told me stories about them. The old ones sealed something in those caves long ago, something that shouldn't be disturbed." Dr. Wright was looking at her readings with a worried face. "These energy readings are off the charts," she said. "And look at this." She held up a compass, which was spinning wildly. "The electromagnetic field in this area is completely distorted." Just then, Deputy Riley burst in. He looked terrible, like he hadn't slept in days. His hands were shaking as he poured himself some coffee. "The dogs," he said. "All the dogs in town are going crazy. They won't go near the caves, and last night I saw." He stopped, like he was afraid to continue. "What did you see?" I asked. "A shadow, but it wasn't normal. It moved through solid rock like it was walking through air. And its eyes," he shuddered. "They were red, glowing red." Billy nodded slowly. "The Ozark Howler," he said. "But that's just what white settlers called it. My people have an older name for it, a name we don't speak out loud." Dr. Wright was checking her instruments again. "Whatever it is, it's affecting everything electronic within a mile of the caves, and the effect is getting stronger." I felt a chill run down my spine as I remembered something. "The missing persons posters," I said. "How many people have disappeared in these caves?" Riley pulled out his notebook. 3 in the past month. But going back through old records, I found something interesting. Every 30 years, like clockwork, people go missing here. Always during droughts. Thunder rumbled outside, but the sky was clear. My radio crackled to life by itself, letting out that same otherworldly howl we'd heard in the cave. Billy stood up, his face grave. "We need to go into those caves," he said. "But first, we need to prepare. There are rituals, protections we must perform, and we'll need help." "I know just the person," Dr. Wright said. "Jack Cooper, the best cave rescue specialist in the state. He's worked in these caves for 20 years. As they talked, I looked out my window at the cave entrance in the distance. Something caught my eye, a tall, dark figure standing at the cave mouth. But when I blinked, it was gone. That night, as I cleaned my Colt Python and packed my gear, the memories of Vietnam kept flooding back. The darkness, the fear, the unknown enemy. But this time felt different. This time, we weren't fighting people. We were up against something else entirely. Little did I know, we had less than 48 hours before everything would go horribly wrong. Jack Cooper arrived early the next morning. He was a tall, lean man with gray hair and a face weathered from years of cave exploration. The moment he stepped out of his truck, all our equipment went haywire. Radios squealing, phones dying, and compasses spinning like crazy. "Never seen anything like this in all my years," Jack said, frowning at his dead GPS. "These caves are my second home, but something's different now." Billy had spent the night preparing for what he called a protection ritual. He laid out items on my office desk: tobacco leaves, white sage, and some kind of red clay powder. The serious look on his face made my stomach turn. "Before we enter," Billy explained, "each of us must be marked with this mixture. It's how my ancestors stayed safe in these caves." His hands trembled slightly as he mixed the ingredients. "But there's something else you need to know. Once we go in, we must stay together. The entity. It plays tricks with your mind, makes you see things that aren't there." Dr. Wright was setting up her equipment when she called us over. "Look at this." She pointed to her screen. "The temperature in cave section B drops by 30 degrees every few hours. That's physically impossible." Deputy Riley hadn't slept again. Dark circles under his eyes made him look 10 years older. "I keep hearing whispers," he admitted. "Even when I'm alone, they're getting louder." I knew that feeling. Last night, I'd woken up to the sound of helicopter rotors, just like in Vietnam. But when I looked outside, there was nothing there. Just that strange mist hanging around the cave entrance. As Billy performed the protection ritual, marking each of our foreheads with the red clay mixture, we heard it again, that bone-chilling howl. This time, it sounded almost like words. "It's calling us," Billy said quietly. "It knows we're coming." We geared up. Ropes, helmets, lights, emergency supplies. I checked my Colt Python one last time. Even though I knew bullets might be useless against whatever we were facing, the weight of the gun was comforting. Just before we entered the cave, Dr. Wright's equipment picked up something strange. "There's a pattern to the energy pulses," she said, "like a heartbeat, but much slower. The cave entrance seemed to swallow all light. Our flashlight beams looked weak against the darkness. The air felt thick, almost alive." "Stay close," Jack warned as we started our descent. "These caves can be tricky even on normal days." That's when we heard Deputy Riley's radio crackle to life. Through the static, a voice came through. It sounded like a child crying. But the words made my blood run cold. "Help me. They're coming through the walls." We all looked at each other, knowing this was our last chance to turn back. But we couldn't. People were missing, and whatever was down there wasn't going to stop. As we moved deeper into the cave, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't just walking into darkness. We were walking into something's home. Something that had been waiting a very long time for visitors. The real horror was about to begin. The deeper we went into the cave, the colder it got. Our breath came out in white puffs, and the walls seemed to glisten with something that wasn't just water. The beam from my UV flashlight caught more of those strange markings. They were everywhere now, pulsing with a faint green glow. Deputy Riley was the first to crack. We'd been walking for about an hour when he suddenly stopped and pointed his flashlight at an empty corner. "Don't you see her?" he whispered, his voice shaking. "The little girl in the white dress?" But there was nothing there, just shadows and limestone. Dr. Wright grabbed his arm. "Riley, remember what Billy said. It plays tricks with your mind." That's when we heard the first scream. It came from deeper in the cave, echoing off the walls until it seemed to come from everywhere at once. It sounded like someone in terrible pain, but also not quite human. "That's impossible," Jack said, checking his map. "These tunnels are supposed to be a dead end, but..." He pointed to a new opening we could see ahead. That passage shouldn't be there. Billy touched the wall near the new tunnel and quickly pulled his hand back. "It's ice cold," he said. "And look," he pointed to the ground. That glowing green substance was seeping out from under the rocks. My radio suddenly burst to life, making us all jump. Through the static, we heard voices, lots of them, all talking at once. Some sounded like children, others like old people, all begging for help. Dr. Wright's equipment was going crazy. "The energy readings are off the scale," she said. "And look at this." She held up a device that measured temperature. "It's dropping fast, too fast." That's when I saw it, just for a second in my flashlight beam. A shadow that looked like a huge cat, but when it moved, it seemed to flow like smoke. Its eyes glowed red like hot coals. Before I could say anything, all our flashlights went out at once. In the pitch darkness, we heard something moving around us. Not walking, but sliding through the rock itself. When our lights came back on a few seconds later, Riley was gone. "Marcus!" I shouted. "Deputy Riley!" His flashlight lay on the ground, still on, pointing at the wall. And on that wall, written in what looked like glowing green liquid, were words in Cherokee. Billy's face went white as he read them. It says, "The hunt begins." A howl echoed through the cave, closer this time, much closer. And mixed with it, we heard Riley's voice, screaming for help. Dr. Wright grabbed my arm. "His voice is coming from inside the rock," she said. "How is that possible?" Jack was already getting his climbing gear ready. "We need to find him. Now." But as we prepared to search for Riley, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The tunnel we'd come through. It wasn't there anymore. Just solid rock wall. The cave was changing around us, and something was in here with us. Something that could move through solid rock. Something that was playing with us like a cat plays with mice. And we were trapped with it. We followed Riley's screams, but they seemed to come from everywhere. The cave tunnels kept changing. Paths that were there one minute would disappear the next. It was like being in a maze that moved by itself. Dr. Wright's face was pale as she checked her instruments. "The temperatures dropped to near freezing," she whispered. "And these energy readings, they're forming a pattern, like it's circling us." Suddenly, Jack held up his hand for us to stop. "Listen." In the silence, we heard something that made my skin crawl. The sound of Riley laughing. Not his normal laugh, but something high and broken, like he'd lost his mind. We found him in a large cave chamber, sitting cross-legged on the ground, staring at the wall. He was covered in that strange green substance. "Marcus?" I said softly, approaching him slowly. "It's Frank. We're here to help." He turned to look at us, and I nearly stumbled back. His eyes were completely black. "They showed me everything," he said in a voice that didn't sound like his own. "The spaces between the rocks, the old ones who lived there. So beautiful, so hungry." Billy started chanting something in Cherokee, holding up a pouch of tobacco. Riley screamed, a horrible, inhuman sound, and then collapsed. Before we could reach him, all our lights went out again. In the darkness, I felt something brush past me, cold as ice. When the lights came back on, Riley was gone. Just gone. "Look at the walls," Dr. Wright gasped. The cave walls were moving. No, not moving. Something was pushing through them, like hands pressing against a rubber sheet. The green substance was oozing from every crack. Jack's voice shook as he spoke. "We need to get out, now." That's when we heard it, a deep, rumbling voice that seemed to come from the rocks themselves. "Too late," it said. "The hunt has begun." The temperature dropped so low our breath turned to ice crystals in the air. In my flashlight beam, I saw something emerge from the wall, a shape that kept changing. First, it looked like a massive mountain lion, then like a man with antlers, then like living shadow. Billy threw his tobacco mixture at it, chanting louder. The thing shrieked, a sound that made my ears ring and my head spin. "Run!" I shouted. We ran through the tunnels, but they kept changing. Behind us, that thing moved through the walls like they were water, getting closer and closer. "Doctor." Wright's equipment was smoking now, sparks flying from it. Jack pointed to a narrow tunnel ahead. "This way, it leads to the underground river." But as we ran, I couldn't shake what I'd seen in Riley's eyes, or the feeling that we weren't just running from something. We were running deeper into its trap. The real nightmare was just beginning, and somewhere in these caves, Riley was still laughing. The underground river roared ahead of us, its black water reflecting our flashlight beams. We were all breathing hard from running, our hearts pounding in our chests. "We need to cross," Jack said, already pulling out his rope. "That thing seems to stay away from moving water." Just then, Dr. Wright screamed. Her backpack with all the scientific equipment burst into flames. She threw it off quickly, and we watched as it melted into a puddle of plastic and metal. "It's getting stronger," Billy said, his voice shaking. "The barriers between its world and ours are breaking down." That's when we heard Eleanor gasp. She was staring at something in the water. When I shined my flashlight there, I saw faces, dozens of them, moving under the surface. They looked like they were screaming. "Don't look at them," Billy warned. "They're not real. It's trying to trick us again." Jack had just finished securing the rope across the river when we heard that laugh again. Riley's broken laugh, echoing off the walls. But this time, it was joined by other voices. "Frank!" A voice called, and my blood froze. It sounded exactly like my ex-wife. "Frank, help me." The cave walls started oozing that green stuff everywhere. The temperature dropped so low it hurt to breathe. Our lights started flickering again. "Move, now!" I shouted. We started crossing the river one by one, holding onto the rope. The water was ice cold and fast. I went last, keeping my gun pointed at the darkness behind us. Halfway across, I saw it. The thing emerged from the cave wall, but this time it looked different. It had taken the shape of my old army buddy who died in Vietnam. "Doc," it said in his voice, "why didn't you save me?" My hands started shaking. I knew it wasn't real, but seeing him there. "Frank, don't listen," Dr. Wright yelled from the other side. "Keep moving." The thing smiled, a horrible, wrong kind of smile, and then changed again. Now it looked like a massive shadow with glowing red eyes. It reached for me with hands made of darkness. I was almost across when I heard Jack scream. Something had grabbed his leg, a hand reaching up from the water. Before any of us could react, he was pulled under. "Jack!" I yelled, but the water where he'd disappeared was already smooth and black again. We stood there, dripping and shaking, down another member of our team. The thing watched us from the other side of the river, its red eyes glowing brighter. "The old ones are hungry," it said in Riley's voice. "So very hungry." Billy grabbed my arm. "We need to get to the sacred chamber," he said. "It's our only chance now, the ritual. It has to be done there." Dr. Wright was crying quietly. "What about Jack? And Riley?" "If we don't stop this thing," I said, "no one will make it out of these caves." As if answering me, that horrible laugh echoed through the caves again. But this time, I could have sworn I heard Jack's voice in it too. We were running out of time, and I had a terrible feeling that the worst was still to come. Billy led us through twisting tunnels, following markings that only he could understand. My flashlight was getting dimmer, and the cold was seeping into our bones. Dr. Wright kept looking back, jumping at every echo. "The sacred chamber is just ahead," Billy said, "but—" He stopped suddenly, his face going pale. In front of us stood Jack Cooper. He looked normal, except his eyes were completely black, just like Riley's had been. "Why are you running?" Jack said, but his voice wasn't his own. It sounded like many voices talking at once. "Don't you want to see the beautiful things in the dark?" Dr. Wright stepped forward. "Jack, if you're still in there." "Eleanor, don't." I grabbed her arm and pulled her back. Jack's face split into an impossible smile, too wide for a human face. His skin began to ripple like water. Billy started his Cherokee chant again, throwing the last of his tobacco mixture. Jack, or whatever was wearing Jack's shape, screamed and melted into the wall. "Run!" I shouted. "The chamber! Now!" We sprinted down the tunnel. Behind us, that awful laughing started again. Now it sounded like Riley, Jack, and something else all laughing together. The sacred chamber was huge, with a high ceiling we couldn't see. Ancient Cherokee markings covered the walls, glowing faintly in our flashlight beams. "Quick," Billy said, pulling out his last pouch of red clay. "We need to." He never finished that sentence. A black shape, like living smoke, shot out of the wall and wrapped around him. Billy screamed once, then disappeared into the solid rock wall. "No!" Dr. Wright cried. The thing emerged again, bigger now. It kept changing shapes, first the mountain lion with red eyes, then a shadow with antlers, then faces I recognized from Vietnam. Each change was faster than the last. "Your protector is gone," it said in Billy's voice. "Now you'll join the others, in the spaces between." My flashlight died. In the darkness, I heard Dr. Wright scream. Something cold brushed past me, and when I finally got my backup light working, she was gone too. I was alone in the chamber. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold my gun. The thing circled me, moving through the walls like they were water. "Just you now, Frank," it said, using the voices of everyone it had taken. "You'll see such wonderful, horrible things." The temperature dropped even lower. Ice started forming on the walls, and in my head, I started hearing the helicopters from Vietnam again. I backed up against a wall covered in Cherokee markings, clutching my gun. The entity was closing in, and I had one last chance to either save everyone or join them in whatever nightmare place lay between the rocks. The real question was, did I have the strength to do what needed to be done? My hands were shaking as I remembered Billy's last words about the ritual. The tobacco pouch he'd dropped was just a few feet away. In my head, the Vietnam flashbacks were getting stronger, the sound of helicopters, my friends screaming, the darkness closing in. The thing was playing with me now, appearing as different shapes all around the chamber. One second it was Riley, then Jack, then Dr. Wright, all with those horrible black eyes. "Join us, Frank," they said together. "The spaces between the rocks, they're so beautiful." I dove for Billy's tobacco pouch, just as something ice-cold grabbed my leg. Looking down, I saw a hand made of shadow trying to pull me into the floor. "No," I yelled, kicking free. I grabbed the pouch and rolled behind a large rock. The entity laughed, that awful mix of voices that made my head hurt. The walls of the chamber started oozing that green stuff everywhere. The air got so cold it hurt to breathe. Then I saw something that made my heart stop. In the wall in front of me, faces started appearing, pushing through the rock like it was rubber. I recognized them all. Riley, Jack, Dr. Wright, Billy, and others. The missing hikers. All of them trapped, all of them screaming silently. "They're all here," the thing said, its voice now sounding like 1,000 whispers. "And you'll join them." But something caught my eye. The Cherokee markings on the wall were glowing brighter where the tobacco had spilled. I remembered what Billy had said about the old rituals, about the sacred tobacco being a key. My hands were trembling as I opened the pouch. The entity realized what I was doing and screamed, a sound that made my ears bleed. "You can't stop us," it shrieked, now showing its true form, a massive shadow with glowing red eyes and a mouth full of darkness. I started spreading the tobacco on the glowing markings, my fingers burning with cold wherever the shadow touched me. The entity was getting desperate, changing shapes faster and faster. It showed me my worst memories from Vietnam, made me hear my friends dying again. But this time, I knew they weren't real. "This ends now," I said, placing the last of the tobacco. The markings on the wall exploded with light. The entity screamed louder than ever, but this time it sounded afraid. The chamber started shaking. Rocks were falling everywhere, and it was being pulled into the wall, right into the glowing markings. "If I go," it said in a voice that shook the whole cave, "they all go with me." I had a choice to make, and only seconds to make it. I knew what I had to do. The entity was being pulled into the wall, and with it, everyone it had taken. I could see them all, their faces pressing through the rock, hands reaching out. Riley, Jack, Dr. Wright, Billy. They were all being dragged deeper into whatever dark place lay between the rocks. Without thinking twice, I grabbed the closest hand, it was Dr. Wright's, and pulled as hard as I could. The cold was unbearable, like thousands of ice needles stabbing into my skin. The entity screamed and tried to pull her back. "Hold on," I shouted, bracing my feet against the wall. One by one, I felt other hands grabbing onto me, Jack, Riley, Billy, even people I didn't know. The entity's screams got louder, shaking loose more rocks from the ceiling. "You'll die here," it shrieked, its red eyes blazing. "The cave will be your tomb." The whole chamber was shaking now. Huge chunks of rock were falling everywhere. The glowing markings on the wall were so bright they hurt my eyes. With one final desperate pull, I felt them all come free, like pulling someone out of quicksand. We fell backward in a heap as the entity gave one last terrible scream. The wall where the markings had been exploded inward, creating a hole that seemed to lead into pure darkness. The entity was sucked in, its red eyes glowing with hate until the very end. Then everything went quiet. Our flashlights came back on. The cave stopped shaking. Riley was the first to speak, his voice hoarse. What happened to us?" Nobody could really answer. Dr. Wright was crying, Jack was shaking, and Billy just stared at the wall where the hole had been, now solid rock again. "We need to get out," I said. "Now." We helped each other up. Everyone was weak and confused, like waking up from a nightmare. The missing hikers were with us too, all alive but barely able to walk. The way out was different now. The cave tunnels had changed, but somehow I knew which way to go. It was like the caves themselves were helping us leave. When we finally saw daylight, it was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. The official report said it was a cave-in caused by the drought. They sealed off that section of Devil's Den, claiming it was structurally unsafe. Nobody believed our story, of course. Who would? But sometimes, on quiet nights when the moon is full, I can still hear that howl echoing from the sealed caves, and I know it's still there, trapped between the rocks, waiting. Riley quit the police force. Jack never went cave exploring again. Dr. Wright published a paper about unexplained electromagnetic phenomena in cave systems, but nobody took it seriously. As for me, I stayed on as ranger. Someone needs to keep watch. Someone needs to remember. Because the Cherokee were right, some things should stay buried, and some caves should stay sealed. Forever. It's been 5 years since that night in Devil's Den. I still work here as a ranger, but things are different now. The caves remain sealed. Thick concrete walls and warning signs keep people away. But that's not enough to stop the whispers. Every full moon, strange lights dance around the cave entrance. The local dogs still won't go near it. And sometimes, late at night, I hear that laugh again, that horrible mix of voices echoing through the trees. Billy visits sometimes. He's the only one who stayed in touch. The others, well, they tried their best to forget. Can't blame them, really. Last week, a young ranger asked me why we don't use Cave Section B anymore. I told him it was unsafe, just like the official report says. But he showed me something that made my blood run cold. A photo on his phone of fresh claw marks on the concrete seal. And next to them, that familiar green glow. The thing is, those caves are like a scar that won't heal. The entity might be trapped, but it's not gone. I can feel it some nights, pushing against the walls of its prison, testing for weakness, waiting. Yesterday, during my patrol, I found new Cherokee markings carved into a tree near the sealed entrance. Billy translated them for me over the phone. His voice was shaking when he read them. The hunger grows, the walls thin, the space between calls. I've started carrying my Colt Python again. I keep Billy's tobacco mixture in my pocket. At night, I check the seals, watching for any sign of that green glow. Because I know something nobody else does, the concrete walls are getting colder. The compasses near the caves spin more often now. And sometimes, when I shine my UV light on the seal, I can see handprints pushing from the other side. They say time heals all wounds, but some wounds go too deep. Some horrors never really end. And in Devil's Den, during the darkest nights, when the moon is full and the wind carries that distant howl, the hunt begins again. I just pray those walls hold, because if they don't, well, this time we might not be strong enough to stop what comes through. My name is Daniel Morrison, but folks around here call me Wolf. I guess that's what happens when you spend most of your life tracking things in the wilderness. Being half Navajo and half Irish makes me a bit different from most rangers in these parts, but that's never bothered me much. The red rocks and canyons of Arizona have been my home for as long as I can remember. I've seen a lot in my 35 years, served as a tracker in Vietnam, worked with the tribal police, and now I patrol these sacred lands as a ranger. The Winchester Point .30-30 on my shoulder and the blessed obsidian knife at my belt are my constant companions. My grandmother, a traditional Navajo elder, gave me that knife before she passed. Some things out here, she'd say, can't be stopped with just bullets. The summer of 1971 was different from any I'd ever known. The drought had turned the land angry, cracked earth, dying vegetation, and a silence that made your skin crawl. Even the wildlife seemed to know something wasn't right. I remember the morning it all started, just as the sun was painting the mesas gold. I was checking on Old Man Thompson's cattle, near the abandoned trading post, when I found the first mutilated calf. Now, I'd seen my share of coyote and mountain lion kills, but this was different. The tracks around the carcass started as coyote prints, then halfway through, they changed into something else, something that made my grandmother's knife grow cold against my hip. As I knelt there in the dust, studying those impossible tracks, I heard a whisper in the wind that sounded almost like my name. Little did I know that morning would be the beginning of the most terrifying weeks of my life. Worse than anything I'd seen in Vietnam. Worse than any nightmare I'd ever had. Something ancient and evil had awakened in these canyons, and somehow, I knew I was the only one who could stop it. The locals started calling it the Red Rock Skinwalker. But before I tell you what happened next, you need to understand that some stories, especially out here in Navajo country, aren't just stories. Some of them have teeth. That first week started with more than just that dead calf. Every morning brought something new and strange. The local kids started telling stories about seeing animals that weren't quite right. Deer with legs too long and twisted, coyotes that walked on two legs when they thought no one was looking. At first, I did what any reasonable person would do, looked for normal explanations. But then the dogs started acting weird. These were tough ranch dogs, used to chasing off coyotes and protecting livestock. But now they wouldn't go near certain parts of the canyon. They'd just stand there, hair raised, whining like scared puppies. My own dog, Scout, who'd been with me through thick and thin, wouldn't even leave the truck when we drove past the old miller's trading post. I remember the evening I met with Joseph Begay, one of our respected elders. We sat on his porch as the sun set. and the way he looked at me made my stomach turn. His weathered face was serious as he spoke. "Wolf," he said, stirring his coffee slowly, "something's walked back into our lands that shouldn't be here. The old ones spoke of them, those who turned away from the good path, who traded their humanity for dark powers. I wanted to brush it off, to say it was just stories. But then he told me about the missing hikers. 3 of them in the past week, all disappeared near the same area. When they found the first one 2 days later, he was speaking in a language nobody recognized, his eyes empty like someone had scooped out his soul. That night, as I drove my patrol route, I saw something that still gives me nightmares. My headlights caught movement on the road ahead, what looked like a massive coyote. But when it turned to look at me, its eyes were human. Not just human-like, but human eyes I recognized. They belonged to Ben White, the local rancher who'd been missing since that morning. The thing smiled at me. A coyote's mouth shouldn't be able to smile. And then it was gone, leaving nothing but dust and a feeling of cold dread in my chest. My hand went to my grandmother's knife, and for the first time since Vietnam, I felt true fear creeping up my spine. I knew then that the stories my grandmother told me weren't just meant to scare children. The skinwalkers were real, and one of them was hunting in my territory. What I didn't know yet was that it had already started hunting me too. The next morning, I went to see Maria Running Horse, our local medicine woman. If anyone knew what we were dealing with, it would be her. Her small house smelled of sage and cedar, and her usually bright eyes were filled with worry. "I've been expecting you, Wolf," she said, pouring us both tea. "The spirits have been restless. Last night, I saw things in my dreams, dark things coming from the old burial caves." As we talked, she told me about the ancient petroglyphs, rock drawings made by our ancestors that had started to seep what looked like blood at night. I thought she was just being superstitious until she showed me photos taken by her grandson. My hands shook as I looked at them. That's when Deputy Rick Torres pulled up in his patrol car. Rick was a good friend, someone I'd worked with for years, but something was off about him that day. His movements were stiff, like someone learning to walk in a new body, and his eyes, they didn't look quite right. "We found Ben White," he said, his voice flat. "Or what's left of him." We drove out to White's ranch together. The sight made my stomach turn. Ben's body looked like it had been in the desert for months, all dried up and mummified, but he'd only been missing for 3 days. The strange tracks were there too, changing from human footprints to something animal-like and back again. While examining the scene, I noticed Rick acting stranger by the minute. He kept staring at nothing, his head tilting at odd angles. When I called his name, he turned to me with a smile that wasn't his own. Without saying a word, he started walking toward the canyon. I tried to stop him, but it was like he couldn't hear me anymore. That evening, a dust storm rolled in, but this wasn't any normal storm. Inside the howling wind, I could hear voices whispering in ancient Navajo. My grandmother's knife grew ice cold against my hip, and Scout wouldn't stop howling. I tried calling Rick's family that night, but no one had seen him since he walked into that canyon. As I sat in my truck, watching the storm swirl red dust across the desert, I knew things were about to get much worse. The skinwalker wasn't just killing people, it was taking them, changing them, using them somehow. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I could feel it watching me, waiting, like a spider in the center of its web. Things took a dark turn the next day. Joseph Begay called me early in the morning, his voice shaking. He'd found something at the sacred site near Eagle Rock, something that made even this tough old man tremble. When I got there, Joseph was standing near the ancient prayer circle. The ground around it was dead, a perfect circle of withered plants and black earth. But what really got to me were the footprints. They were everywhere, like something had been dancing all night, each print changing shape, human, coyote, deer, and things I couldn't even name. "It's mocking us, Wolf," Joseph said quietly. "It's mocking everything sacred to our people." That's when we heard it. A sound like laughter, but wrong. like several voices laughing at once. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Scout started growling, backing up against my legs. Suddenly, Joseph grabbed my arm. His eyes went wide as he looked past me. "Don't turn around," he whispered. "Whatever you do, don't look in its eyes." But I could feel it behind me. The air turned cold, and I could hear breathing. Wet, heavy breathing that no human or animal should make. Joseph started chanting a protection prayer, his voice getting stronger with each word. Then, everything happened too fast. Joseph shoved me aside and turned to face whatever was there. I heard him shout one last word in Navajo, a word of power my grandmother had taught me, and then there was a terrible screech. By the time I got to my feet and turned around, Joseph was gone. Just gone. Only his turquoise necklace remained on the ground, the stones cracked and dark. That night, as I sat in my cabin cleaning my Winchester, my Vietnam memories started flooding back. But they were different now, twisted. In each memory, the enemy soldiers had animal faces, and their eyes. Their eyes were always watching me. The radio crackled with reports of more missing people. Maria Running Horse called crying, saying she couldn't see anymore, not because her eyes were damaged, but because something had stolen her sight after she tried to perform a cleansing ceremony. I knew then that I had to end this. The skinwalker wasn't just attacking random people, it was taking out anyone who might be able to stop it. And somehow, I knew I was next on its list. I spent that night looking through my grandmother's old journals. She'd written about skinwalkers, about how they choose their victims, about their weaknesses. One thing kept showing up. They're drawn to family blood. That's when it hit me like a punch to the gut. My grandmother hadn't given me that obsidian knife just for protection. She knew. She knew something like this would come for me. The next morning, I found Scout whining at something outside. There, scratched deep into my front door, was a symbol I recognized from my grandmother's journals. It was a family mark, my family's mark, but twisted wrong. Below it were tracks leading toward the old burial caves. I knew it was a trap. Of course it was a trap. But I also knew I had to go. More people would die if I didn't. I got my gear ready. The Winchester, extra bullets blessed by Maria before she was blinded, my grandmother's knife, and some sacred herbs. As I was loading up my truck, my radio crackled. Through the static, I heard Rick Torres's voice. Wolf helped the caves. It wasn't really Rick. I knew that. Rick had been gone for days. But hearing his voice, scared and pleading, made my hands shake anyway. The drive to the caves felt like hours, even though it was only 30 minutes. The air got heavier with each mile, and the sky turned a strange reddish color. No birds sang, no insects buzzed. Just silence. I parked at the base of the canyon and started climbing. The rocks felt wrong under my hands, too warm, almost like they were alive. Scout refused to come with me this time. Smart dog. Near the cave entrance, I found more tracks. But these were different. They were my own tracks, from days ago, when I hadn't even been there. The skinwalker was playing mind games, trying to make me question everything. Then I heard it, a voice that sounded like my grandmother's, calling from deep inside the cave. "Daniel, come home, child." My heart was pounding so hard I could barely breathe. I checked my Winchester one last time, gripped my grandmother's knife tight, and stepped into the darkness of the cave. Whatever was in there had been waiting for me for a long, long time. The cave was darker than any place I'd ever been. My flashlight beam seemed to get swallowed up by the darkness. The air smelled old and wrong, like rotting leaves and something else I couldn't name. As I went deeper, I started hearing whispers, some in English, some in Navajo, some in languages I'd never heard before. They echoed off the walls, making it impossible to tell where they were coming from. Then I saw the first body. It was Rick Torres, or what was left of him. He was sitting against the wall, looking like he'd been there for years, all dried up like Ben White had been. His eyes were open, staring at nothing. I wanted to stop, to help him somehow, but I knew it was too late. The tunnel opened into a large cave. The walls were covered with glowing symbols, not the sacred kind, but twisted versions that hurt my eyes to look at. In the center was a circle of black sand, and standing in it was me. Not really me, of course. It was the skinwalker, wearing my face like a mask that didn't quite fit right. It smiled with my mouth, but the eyes were all wrong, black and empty, like looking into deep wells. "Brother," it said in my voice. Finally. Then it told me something that turned my blood to ice. It wasn't just any skinwalker, it was my grandmother's brother, my great-uncle, who disappeared 50 years ago. He'd chosen the dark path, turned himself into this thing, and had been waiting all these years for another family member strong enough to take his place. "Your grandmother knew," it said, still using my voice. "She gave you that knife to bring to me, to complete the circle." That's when the cave started spinning. The walls breathed like they were alive. I saw Vietnam again, but the jungle was full of skinwalkers. I saw my grandmother's funeral, but she sat up in her coffin with black eyes. Everything I knew was turning inside out. I gripped the obsidian knife so hard my hand hurt. The skinwalker took a step toward me, its shape flickering between my face and something terrible, something with too many teeth and eyes in all the wrong places. "Join us," it whispered. "Or join them." It gestured to the bodies I could now see scattered around the cave. All the missing people, all the victims. I knew I had only one chance to end this. But what happened next? That's the part that still gives me nightmares. I raised my grandmother's knife, and that's when I remembered her last words to me. "The knife isn't the weapon, Wolf. It's just a key. Your blood, your spirit, that's the real weapon." Suddenly, a huge storm started inside the cave. Red sand swirled everywhere, and the skinwalker changed shapes faster than I could blink. Coyote, deer, my face, my grandmother's face, things I can't even describe. The walls pulsed with that sickly glow, and the whispers turned into screams. "You can't stop this," it growled, its voice changing with each word. "The darkness is in your blood too." I felt something then, a pull, like the thing was trying to reach inside my mind. Images flashed through my head. Me as a skinwalker, powerful, immortal, hunting through these canyons forever. For a second, just a second, I wanted it. That's when I heard another voice, clear as day, my grandmother's real voice, not the skinwalker's fake one. "Remember who you are, Daniel." I gripped the knife tight and did something crazy. I cut my own palm. As my blood hit the black sand, something amazing happened. The cave filled with light, but not from the twisted symbols. This light came from everywhere and nowhere, warm and bright like sunlight. I saw them then, shadows at first, then clearer. All my ancestors, standing in a circle around us. My grandmother was there, and faces I knew from old photos, and faces I'd never seen before but somehow recognized. The skinwalkers screamed, a horrible sound that shook rocks from the ceiling. It tried to run, to change shape, to fight back. But my blood had trapped it in that circle of black sand. I started speaking the words my grandmother had taught me. Not a curse, but a blessing. Each word felt like fire in my mouth. The skinwalker thrashed and howled, its shapes all melting together. Then everything exploded in white light. When I could see again, I was lying on the cave floor. The skinwalker was gone. In its place was a small pile of white sand, and in the middle of it my great-uncle's turquoise necklace, not corrupted like the one the skinwalker had left behind, but clean and bright. I stumbled out of the cave as the sun was setting. My whole body hurt, and the cut on my palm throbbed, but I was alive. Scout was waiting right where I'd left him, and he looked at me like he knew something was different. The bodies of the victims, Rick, Ben, and the others, were never found. When I went back to the cave the next day with the tribal police, the tunnel had collapsed. Only my great-uncle's turquoise necklace proved that any of it had been real. Maria Running Horse got her sight back that same night. She said she woke up just as the sun was setting, right when I was in that cave. She told me later that she'd dreamed of our ancestors forming a circle of light. The drought broke the next day. Rain fell for 3 days straight, washing the red dust from everything. The animals came back, and the dogs stopped acting scared. But things weren't completely back to normal. Sometimes, on quiet nights, I still hear whispers in the wind. The petroglyphs don't bleed anymore, but they glow faintly under the full moon. And there's a perfect circle near the cave entrance where nothing will grow, no matter how much rain falls. I kept my grandmother's knife and my great-uncle's necklace. Every year, I go back to that spot to perform a blessing ceremony. Not because I'm afraid the skinwalker will return. I know it won't. I do it to remember, to keep watch, and to honor the promise I made to protect these lands. The locals still talk about the Red Rock skinwalker, but the story's different now. They say the land has a new guardian, someone who walks between two worlds. Someone who carries an obsidian knife and wears a turquoise necklace. I don't tell them it was me. Some stories are better left as just stories. But every now and then, when I'm out on patrol and the sun is setting behind the red rocks, I touch the scar on my palm and remember that night in the cave. I remember that the most dangerous monsters aren't always the ones that change their shape. Sometimes they're the dark parts of ourselves that we have to face. Scouts still won't go near that cave, though. And maybe that's for the best. Some places should stay empty, some doors should stay closed, and some stories. Well, some stories should just be whispered around campfires, where the light keeps the darkness at bay.